Alright, so in the last video, I talked about how the New World, or North and South America, basically, were being carved up by different countries. We talked about the Dutch colonies and Spanish and Portuguese, and then before we talked about the English and the French. So this is the emblem of the Sun King, Louis XIV of France. He believed that the glory of France was reflected in the size of his empire. So he thought, the more of an empire France had, the more powerful it was, and maybe the closer to God he was. He kind of thought himself as a god. It's a pretty weird time in history. So the late 17th century, so we're zipping back in time just a touch, so in the 1600s, France was growing more and more powerful under this king. And then on the other hand, Spain was diminishing in power, so they had stripped all their colonies of materials. Remember last time we talked about how Spain and Portugal weren't really good at making colonies, just like places where they could take the stuff and leave. So they had been stripping their colonies of materials, but failing to create sustainable industries. So it wasn't a place where you could go and live there and live out your life. You just went there, you took the stuff, you went home. And then also at this time, England and France were fighting for power. They have a long history of fighting each other. And then in the colonies, Britain was focused on farming, and France was focused on furs. And farming made the land useless for hunting, so those two goals didn't really line up with each other. So it's not like they could really share land. Farming, furs. France had a really big army. Britain had a really big and very well organized navy. And so when they were fighting on several fronts. So they were fighting in Europe on land with allies. And then at sea, one-on-one over major routes. So that would be like British and French naval ships fighting each other. No allies there. And they were fighting to kind of keep their trade routes. And there was also fighting overseas with their colonists and First Nations allies. So you had fighting on 3 fronts at this point, or 3 major fronts. What do you think, now just think to yourself, I guess, what do you think fighting in so many places would do to an empire, to their army? So these are all of the different colonies or colonial powers. I can't recall what year, but this is going to be around 1600s, 1700s, that kind of thing. So you can see at this point, England is here, got colonies here and over here, but not a huge presence in the world. The Netherlands, just little bits and pieces. France had quite this large one, so you can see a big chunk of Canada, and then down to Louisiana, etc. So fighting in lots of different places, as a nation fighting everywhere, you have to send your people off to these different places to fight. So it splits up the army. You guys can think about what that might mean for a nation. Wars, exciting. So there's a couple of wars we're going to kind of gloss over. Normally I'd spend more time talking about them, but we don't really have that time. So the War of the Grand Alliance, 1689 to 1697. This was an alliance trying to stop French expansion. It was a draw. And the War of the Spanish Succession, 1701 to 1713. This was an alliance to prevent the French prince, keep trying to say Fresh Prince, from inheriting the Spanish throne. France was weakened. France lost Acadia. So Acadia would be, there's Nova Scotia, kind of this general area. And they constructed a massive fort on Cape Breton Island, Fortress Louisbourg. That's what they had done when they had Acadia. There's Acadia. Then there's the War of Austrian Succession, 1740-ish to 1763, and this was an alliance to prevent a French ally from inheriting the Austrian throne. So you can see, stop, where's my mouse here? Stop French expansion, stop French expansion, and stop French expansion. Everybody basically was worried that France was going to take over the world. And most importantly, the British were worried. So Fortress Louisbourg was handed back to the French in return for Madras in India. And at this point, the New France population was about 43,000. The British colonies population, so that's kind of like the eastern states, had 1 million people. They had too many people and not enough land, so they wanted to change that. So what did they do? They had this new territory in Acadia, and they thought, maybe we should put our people there. The Acadians knew that this was coming, so they agreed not to fight against the British, but how could the British really be sure about their loyalty? They decided, instead of worrying about their loyalty to the French, they'd just throw them all out of Acadia. So that solves the loyalty problem and the land problem. Get to move people from like all these areas up into Acadia. And the Acadians were sent to various places, so they were mostly sent to places that France still held. So there's Quebec, some of the little islands over here, and to New Orleans. So this is kind of where that Cajun culture comes from. So Cajun culture comes from the Acadians. But this had devastating effects of the 11,000 people thrown out of Acadia. 1,700 died at sea, so it's pretty dangerous to travel that way at the time. But like I said, they were sent to the 13 colonies, which is what Britain owned, or to France. Many of them ended up in Louisiana. Some Acadians for you.